Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Thursday night program with the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Abby Huffman. I'm Director of Programs with ACHS. We're so glad that you're here. Because this is airing out on YouTube, if y'all like these kinds of programs, please like, subscribe, and share so that you can see more in the future if you enjoy this one. And part of what we do with ACHS is we're trying to find the newest and coolest stories, maybe speakers you haven't heard from in a while or haven't heard from at all, and try to give you a different angle, not only on the civilians here in Adams County, but also about Civil War history and things that affect our town here. And you are going to enjoy the speaker tonight. You're going to hear from Harold Knudsen, and he's going to talk to us a lot about one of my favorite generals during the battle, which is General James Longstreet. So Harold, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Abby. Thank you for inviting me. I want to start here with just give you a little background on myself, and this is the cover of my book with Savas Beatty. And just to let you know, you can read the main points of my commissioned service, the years I was in the Army, some of the schools here. And the point of this, to show you this, is to give the reader and the listener tonight an idea of the kind of person that I am as a professional military officer. I was an officer, now I'm retired, but I still work for the Army. And it's because of that, this is the lens that I come at the subject with. I'm not a typical academic historian. I'm not a typical biographer. I am looking at the subject through military analysis and understanding of military history from other periods of time. And that's what you're going to see a little bit of tonight as I get through part of my book. So with that, I will also want to throw, now this is a very busy looking slide. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I just want to point out that most people who have at least heard something about General Longstreet have probably understood or gotten the impression that he is viewed as generally sort of negatively throughout the historiography. And that's a true statement. There are a lot of historians in the past who didn't like him for a number of reasons, and he was attacked. He was the victim of kind of a character assassination in the decades after the war, after Robert, well, not right after the war, but after Robert E. Lee died in 1870. And, you might hear the certain types of things said about him, like you see in this newspaper paragraph that I have at the top center, that General Longstreet is this appalling moral failure. The origins of this lost cause Longstreet controversy are many, and they're very complex, and I'm not here to talk about those tonight, but there are a number of points that occurred that started this 1866, right after the war being the beginning, where he believed, or at least the writer, Mr. Swinton, for his book Campaigns of the Army of the Potomac, gleaned from Longstreet that Lee promised to fight a defensive campaign up in Pennsylvania. And so this was one of the start points. So and you can see there in 1866 and 67 what Longstreet's activities were. In 1868, he joins the Republican Party. He is more vocal about now supporting rights for freed slaves. Here's an example of something he said. He issued a general order when he was in charge of militia in the state of Louisiana later on. He says this here: you will accept the civil and political equality of all men and agree not to attempt to deprive any person of color, race, or previous condition of any political or civil right. And you might think that this is something that you might see a company or a government put out today as guidance along the lines of civil rights and such. So, he was in that sense some forward thinking, not only militarily, but also with where the country was going at the end of, with having now the 13th and the 14th Amendment added to the Constitution. But of course, this didn't sit well with a few of his detractors like Jubal Early there and some others like William Pendleton, who attacked his record after the war. So that is the history, a lot of the historiography and a lot of the legacy that he had to deal with after the war. And for me, I didn't see that, once I got to understand my profession as a military officer, and I started to look at some of the things he did and others, but when I started to look at him, I got to the impression that I got to the realization rather that I think all of this was really propaganda, and they ignored the truth of what he was doing was very forward thinking. And so this is hence you get the title, part of the title of my book. It's a general who fought the next war. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about. And so I'm going to get to today an example of his modern defense on a very large scale and his modern offense. These are primarily going to be tactical examples, these portions of the book. And those are Fredericksburg and Chickamauga. And in between, I'll talk a little bit about his strategic estimate going into 1863 through the lens of what occurred at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in those situations. So anyway, Army officers coming out of West Point and maybe any other academy in the early in the early decades of the nation, and after the Napoleonic period and through the antebellum decades, generally we're taught that Napoleonic warfare was close quarters, meaning that the tactical offense was dominant. Well, I should say, and the tactical offense was dominant. And you can see a picture like this, a painting like this, showing the two sides had to get relatively close to each other in the time of Napoleon to engage. And that was because of this weapon here, the flintlock rifle of the time period. This was the technology. This example is the British version. It could be loaded about 3 times per minute. And as somebody said from the time period, a musket will strike the figure of a man at 80 yards. It may even at 100, but a soldier must be very unfortunate indeed who will be wounded at 150. So that's why they had to be relatively close. 80 yards is relatively close, and they created these line formations, and the leaders, the lieutenants and the NCOs, the sergeants would fashion their tactics around what they could accomplish at 80 yards. They might stand, the British, for example, might stand out 80 yards away from their opponent, take a volley, not fire on them, but then move forward as fast as they can while the enemy is reloading. They might stop halfway at 40 yards and then open fire on the enemy who's loading, and they're going to get many more of them because they've cut the distance in half and then maybe close with the bayonet. So this sort of thing is why they believe that the tactical offense was superior, because they should, all things being equal then, if they had done their plays correct, if you want to use a sports analogy, should overcome a defender when they're standing out in the open and they've got and they've already they've gotten closer and taken some of them down. So that's the general thinking of the time period. But there were some situations in this time period where the direct approach tactical offense failed. And this was against a well-prepared, resolute defense. Here are 2 examples. One in 1775, where the British tried to took Bunker Hill. They did take it eventually with the direct approach, but their casualties were horrible. 800 soldiers killed to do that. Another example, a few decades later, was the Battle of New Orleans. 2,000 British casualties, nearly 300 dead, whereas the Americans only lost 13 men killed because of the protection that they had from the works that they were defending. In this case, they defeated the British completely. So even though these things were going on, this was not always what they were teaching, I don't think. And so that's why the tactical offense was generally considered dominant. Now, I think for General Longstreet, well, at the time, he was Lieutenant Longstreet in the time of the Mexican War during his service there. I think he came out of this war with a very stinging, painful lesson that he suffered, that he was part of, the American Army that they suffered there at this particular battle of Molino El Rey, which is the assault, the taking of a fortified Mexican town with a wall all the way around it. You can see in this painting here. And he was part of an attack on a structure called Casamata, which protruded from the walled city. And the Americans that he was with were repulsed during the assault, and Lieutenant Longstreet was wounded in the leg at the time. So I'm of the opinion that he came away from this war with a lesson that what we had learned in school was not the whole story. The whole story is that, yeah, the tactical offense works in certain circumstances, but it's not always true in all circumstances. And the tactical defense works better in certain circumstances. And he brought that forward into, the war between the states when he left the U.S. Army and then went into the Confederate Army. So now I don't want to go into the first year of the war, all of the tactical level things that happened to Manassas, and then the first Manassas, and then the Peninsula campaign. I just want to, but I will sum it up with the second Manassas. Everything from the first Manassas through the Peninsula in the east, through Jackson's battle at Cedar Mountain, which then culminates in Lee sending him further forward to get around Pope and get at Manassas, and then he takes a defensive position near the old battlefield, and then Lee and Longstreet show up and attack. Shows everything that happened in that first year was, in my view, as a military professional, a heavy learning curve, a steep learning curve in getting the right force structure, the right organizational structure brought forward in the Army, in the Confederate Army, so that they could wield these formations better and do a better job. At the Battle of Manassas, these were just mostly regiments and brigade commanders struggling to keep their units together, and they were kind of fighting their own little battles with some other unit on the other side. You saw a lot of this in the Peninsula as well, and they were trying to put together the brigade. It was basically a brigade-centric army then. And about halfway through, they start being able to fight divisions. Longstreet's one of the ones who's able to control a division better than anyone else. And at the end, he puts together two divisions in a corps-size attack, which is successful. Now you get to second Manassas, and he's the first one to put together. He's in charge now of 5 divisions. He doesn't have to not only command his own division, plus make sure another one is tied into him and make sure they both go in together. Now he's there to direct 5 division commanders, and it works great. And of course, we know that he attacks Pope's left flank and sends that army into flight as they're fixed on Jackson. So this to me is that's just part of the beginning part of the book is about all of that. And I think that the second Manassas is therefore a victory not only of tactics, but really it is a victory of improved organizational structure and command and control, improved command and control that you get from the right organizational structure. So after that, Lee wants to move forward up into Maryland for his Maryland campaign. He has a number of ideas that they're hoping will come to fruition by going into Maryland, ostensibly hoping that the secessionists in the state will be emboldened by his army being up there and try for another secession convention rather, and break away from the state, that he can feed his army there, that he might get recognition from the British, and those kinds of things are what he's hoping to happen. And that, unfortunately, that doesn't happen. The people who are for the Confederacy are still somewhat on the fence of whether or not they're going to attempt another secession convention, so that doesn't happen. And then of course McClellan starts coming at him, and it results in the Battle of Antietam. Here's the big picture. As you know, it starts on the left, where McClellan first goes after Stonewall Jackson's wing at the battle, and they have a lot of fighting in the cornfield there. On his side, he's able to sustain his side, hold off the Union, and stabilize his side. And then later, they come after the right side, and General Longstreet is going to be in charge of that here. And here's a close-up of that situation, Longstreet's side. And, as you know, everyone knows about the sunken road there at Antietam. There's a picture of it where many of the troops on his side were taking position in it, and they were lower than their Union opponents who were going to come across an open plain. And I have that marked off in a rectangle there in a kill zone. And those would be the units under Anderson and primarily Rhodes who have the advantage of this lower sunken road. And the advantage of this is that they're only presenting their body really from maybe the middle of the thigh up, and they're lower than the Union soldiers, which helps them control their volleys. The volleys don't, in the war, in the beginning of the war, they had a propensity to fly over their opponent. And here they were more likely to hit their opponent. And it was true here with 2,200 in this part of the right angle of the sunken road under Anderson there, are able to, hold off nearly 9,000 at points of the Union coming at them several times and inflict heavy casualties. And it's only when the Union realize they need to get on the flank there, the right side where the number 2,200 is on the map, and enfilade the Confederates. Then they finally overtake the sunken road. They push them back. And of course, Longstreet has to counterattack and slow them down. They're not able to retake the sunken road, but they stop the Union effort in that area, and by the end of the day, they hold the field. And so the point about Antietam here in strategic defense is that this is where he starts to really think on a larger scale that the tactical defense is dominant against a direct approach attack like this, and that there's more that can be done with it than what they did at Antietam, which was pretty good. The next, where he's going to bring that forward is the next major battle, which is in December of 1862. And he's out just before then at Culpeper Courthouse with General Lee. They get word that General Burnside is going to take over command of the army, and he's going to come down and probably try to cross the river at this point, Fredericksburg, and then move toward Richmond, which would be a lot faster than what McClellan had tried to do before, coming from way out of the peninsula. So he tells General Longstreet, take your wing and move out to Fredericksburg and start setting up blocking positions there. I will go get Stonewall Jackson and bring him in and join you as soon as we can. So then Longstreet gets here and he sees this open plain you can see there in the top picture between the town and the base of Maurice Heights here at the bottom of the top photo. He also sees a much better sunken road, which is the lower left-hand picture, which you can see is much taller as far as the wall there, where his soldiers are going to be able to lean up against and rest their elbows on when they have their weapons and point their weapons at the Union who are going to come across them on that open grass there. And this place is better than Antietam because they are only showing their shoulders and above instead of the middle of their thigh and above. So they're well protected here as well. And then also he's going to place his artillery in behind the infantry and incorporate that into the defense on a massive scale that hasn't been really done before. So the idea here is that he's going to allow the Union to come across the river, to come through the town. He wants them to come into that open area and reassemble and then come at him. So it's a kind of a ruse as well. He doesn't set up a defense right in the town to make it impossible for them to cross. He wants them to cross, but he has some, he puts some soldiers in the town, some sharpshooters to harass the Union. so that they think, that they are being opposed a little bit. You can see the splashes in the water there in this depiction of them bridging the river as they're trying to get across. And then they finally do bridge it, and then they fight their way through the town, chase the Confederates off, and end up on the other side. And then they reassemble on the other side. The first part of the battle, which I don't have on the slide, is actually, once Burnside assembles his army on the other side, he first goes after the right wing, and Stonewall Jackson got there and was in place there on the right by Lee. I'll just say this, that first the Union, in the morning phase when they go after Stonewall Jackson, they do penetrate his line, and Stonewall Jackson had about a day to prepare. And he could dig a little bit, and so his guys have about as much cover as Longstreet's men had at the Sunken Road in Antietam. So a little better than just standing out in the open. Anyway, Major General Meade, who was a division commander on the Union side at that time, does penetrate Jackson's line in one spot, but then he's pushed out by Jackson, and Jackson stabilizes it. And then about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they come after Longstreet, which is a much stronger position there at Marie's Heights. And as Longstreet had envisioned, they have to come right through that open area in between because, and they have their line anchored to the Rappahannock. The Union cannot outflank it because of the rocks and strong current there in the river there to their left, and the marshy areas elsewhere, these drainage ditches and such. So they have to come right into this area that Longstreet has planned for them, which we call a kill zone today. And this is what happens. 13 some assaults, and not one of them is able to penetrate the line. Each one is broken up. The dotted line there shows where most of the Union soldiers allegedly fell. So about 3:45 is when Burnside finally calls it off, and it's quite a horrible repulse. What happens there? We get this Longstreet. Lee is up there with Longstreet watching this, and we get this famous quote from him that I'm sure everybody has read somewhere in the historiography. So what is it that he? So this is where I find that he's doing something that you find in the next war, like the First World War. Longstreet is able to achieve a level of real radical lethality here that hasn't been done before. And what he does is he creates a textbook kill zone. A kill zone we learn in the Army is one where you can have your units arrayed around a piece of terrain that your enemy is going to be channeled into, and they're going to have interlocking fields of fire. That's the first thing you're going to do with your infantry. Make sure that everything is covered. That means every single spot in there is covered, and the enemy has nowhere to hide. And you're going to have lanes of fire, which are going to allow for disciplined fire control. And in this case, since he doesn't have automatic weapons like we do in the 20th century, but we did in the 20th century and still today, he's going to have a line of firers on the wall, and then 2 men behind each guy, generally, who's going to just load the weapons. This is different. It's not everybody's not shooting. Only 1/3 of the men are shooting. 2/3 of the men are loading. So when one man fires the target, he fires, then he hands back the empty. One of those 2 men who are loading should have one of their rifles loaded, hands it to him, and he fires a new target and shoots on it, and then hands that empty back, and the other guy has a loaded musket ready for him. So he, as I said in that slide with the British Brown Bess picture on there, that the musket of the late 18th century and mostly the 19th century could shoot about 3 rounds a minute. It could be loaded and fired that many times by a trained marksman. Maybe a well-trained marksman could get 4 in a minute. But with this arrangement, now the man on the firing line is going to get his rate of fire up to 8, 9, 10, 11 rounds per minute, depending on how fast the guys behind him reload those things. So here he's increased the rate of fire, and he's almost achieved sort of the effect of the machine gun that made the no man's land so deadly in World War One. And then also the artillery deployment. The the cannon that you saw in that picture there could shoot about a mile, so the soldiers could see where the round was going to land. And that's depicted here on the slide with the gray arrow to the bottom left there, closest to that red, target explosion symbol there. And that's about a mile, maybe a mile and a half. So it was essentially in this time period, it was essentially a direct fire weapon. They could pretty much see what they were shooting at until the smoke accumulated, and no longer could. But the point being is that these weapons were still limited in what they could do as far as accuracy is concerned. By 1863, there were some rifled cannon that came into the inventory that could shoot over 2 miles, and a lot of these were actually in carriages that were on the coast, so that they could reach out and hit ships and weapons you might see like at Fort Fisher, North Carolina. But in the 1880s, late 1880s, they finally figured out how to improve the breech loading cannons so that the cannons were loaded from the rear. The breech would open up, you put the round in, the powder bag in, you close it, and it would seal and hold and withstand the expanding gases. And this meant that you could fire at targets that were well beyond the horizons you couldn't see. And this ushered in the need for mathematical and geometric computational procedures of firing data. Have a grid system, a chart like you see in there in the upper right-hand corner with protractors and firing tables, and all of that had to be done then to make indirect fire artillery accurate. And there are lots of things that go into the computational procedures I'm not going to get into, but the point being is that now weapon systems could fire from great distances like these modern guns, these self-propelled guns on tracked vehicles. And you can see they can shoot from 20 miles out. That 203 millimeter gun round goes over 7 miles in the air before it starts to come down in its downward trajectory. So all of this means that now you can spread out your artillery and tie it all in with radio communications and so on. And all of the computational procedures, we still use the chart as a backup, but all of that then is done on computers like this hardened laptop you see here that goes in a track, and these fire direction soldiers do all that computing, and they send the data down to the gun lines, to the howitzers, and to fire. But in the 18th century and the 19th century, artillery was still what we say decentralized. In other words, it was direct support. So let's say this terrain feature here on the bottom is Mary's Heights, and you got 3 artillery batteries depicted there. And in front of, I guess I should have had a unit icon there, an infantry unit, but in front of the guns there, to the 4 guns to the far left, they would be supporting a Confederate infantry unit working for them and firing in concert with whatever they want to stop, say, a Union attack in their front. If they saw a target over to the right, they probably aren't going to participate in it because they're working directly for that Confederate infantry colonel, the unit that they directly support. But with the advent of what the artillery could do in modern times, in my time, spread out and reach, be coordinated with radio and wire and computers, they can sometimes be used to pile in on targets that a higher level commander wants, like a corps commander. And that's what Longstreet does here. Now, he doesn't have fire direction computers, he doesn't have radio, he doesn't have wire communications, but he uses his artillery coordinator, Porter Alexander, to array the artillery in behind all of the infantry at Fredericksburg, mostly on Mary's Heights, and coordinate it all so that it'll fire into the kill zone in support of the infantry. The infantry units don't get any direct support artillery. Here in this application, Longstreet takes it away from them and puts it all under Porter Alexander. And that's what you see happening here at the at Marie's Heights. And they break up, this breaks up the first three Union assaults exclusively. And you get this this result here. So to close up here on this, conclude on this tactical defensive thing, here's Fredericksburg. We have several steps in a modern defense. First one is visualize how the enemy is going to approach and how he's going to fight. And this is definitely what he does. Next, select where and how, to kill the enemy, where to set up your kill zone, where to position your forces with your direct fire, and then last, to plan the indirect fires to pile in on that as well. And here he does that perfectly on a huge scale, I think, for the first time in the Civil War. And as I said, this is pretty much a perfect kill zone textbook, modern U.S. Army kill zone done in 1862, which I think is important achievement for him at that point. So coming out of 1862 into after the new year, in 1863, Longstreet realizes that he's got a formula here to make it very painful for the Union Army to continue to prosecute the war. Now, one thing they need to do, though, is come up with some kind of a national military strategy. And the Confederacy does not have that. The Union does. When the war started, Winfield Scott was still on active duty, and he advised the Lincoln administration of his what they call the Anaconda Plan. Or this one here, this slide here calls it the Great Snake. But the idea being a naval blockade along the eastern seaboard in the Gulf of Mexico to interdict and prevent too much resupply of war materials from Europe, to split the Confederacy down along the Mississippi River, and then attack using their greater numbers, larger armies to attack in concert, against the Confederate armies, which should be smaller, and overwhelm them with heavy numbers to weigh on them that way. Now, that last part, the Union was not doing well the way that Scott had intended it to be. And that doesn't really happen until Grant comes into the picture as the commanding, as the top general for all the Union armies in April of 1864. And here you see this comment that he makes here. All armies are to move together toward one common center. But in that sense, he's meaning all armies are to be employed all at the same time, so that the Confederates can't work on stopping us in one area while the other area is not active. So Longstreet looks at this and he realizes that we have to do something about this, and the only way to do that is to have a strategic defense, not go into the north, but use the interior lines of the defensible nation, which he determines is from the Mississippi River across Tennessee over to Virginia, with the primary armies, which they have, which are Lee, Bragg, and then what Johnston has further west in Mississippi and along the coast, and use those rail lines, which you see here depicted in green and red. The different colors mean there are different gauges to the rail, but it still works. Everything to the west of the Mississippi River, they don't have a primary army, a large enough army to be part of this, but this they've got to defend as far as Longstreet's concerned. And what he envisions is that within this context of the strategic defense, we will have operational level offensives to go after targeted Union penetrations. We'll try to use our rail, get there faster than them, build a window of numerical superiority, go after them, hopefully defeat them, and then realign again. And this way we should make it so that they can't defeat us. And that's his idea. So now going into early 1863, here's the problem that they're looking at with his defensive offensive idea. Now, he's advocating Western concentration, and the two places for that are Tennessee and Bragg, or Mississippi and reinforce Johnston. But Lee initially doesn't want to do any of this. He is somewhat parochial at the time to Virginia, and he convinces the powers to be at the time that the thing to do is invade Pennsylvania. He believes doing that is going to cause the Lincoln administration to have to cease and desist with what's going on around Vicksburg and send reinforcements to eject him from Pennsylvania. Plus, he will also pull Meade out of Virginia. He will be able to feed his army in Pennsylvania. So again, there are a number of theories here that he's working with to do this. Now, he also works on General Longstreet to get him on his side. And Longstreet he doesn't want to go into Pennsylvania. He doesn't think this is the right use of the assets. But if he's got to do it, he counters his boss and says, "Well, then let's use defensive tactics if we have to fight a fight. I'll receive an attack. You can use the other two corps to defend my flank." So this is the understanding that he thinks they're going up there with. But here's the problem. Here are a couple maps from my book here about this situation. Lee, the second point here, Lee never really defines a campaign objective, and that becomes a problem. As they go up into Pennsylvania, most of June is used to forage, and they still don't, but have a place though that their corps commanders are supposed to go to and do something a little more substantial to harm the enemy. Now, Ewell reaches the outskirts of Harrisburg late June, and then finally Lee declares Harrisburg the objective on the 27th. But then he reverses himself the next day to order this concentration around Cashtown and Gettysburg. He thinks this is going to nudge Meade to the east if they concentrate there, which is not true. Meade goes to ground and they fight there at Gettysburg and battles join. But I have here a situation on the top map in Europe, what we call the Fulda Gap back in the 1980s, where we were going to defend. I was in the United States Army in Europe there, where we were going to defend against the massive Soviet invasion of Germany. And we were the U.S. 5th Corps, which was also at Gettysburg, and 2 divisions, 3rd Armored Division and 8th ID. I was 8th ID. And we were going to use these kill zones. We call them bowls. They're those black circles. There were 2 examples there. Fulda was one around the city of Fulda. Another one was Hunfeld. We were going to use these to attrit these Soviet supporting attacks that were going to come after us. And we believed that we would, because we had superior equipment and a better NCO corps, more operational and tactical acumen, that we would be able to break up some of these supporting attacks in a timely manner and then fall on that main attack there, that long red arrow that was coming down the Autobahn to Gießen, and we would fall on that and break it up too, and we would be successful that way. And now the Third World War never happened over there, but this was generally what we were thinking we were going to have to do, and we were confident that we would have success with it. Likewise, this would be something, an objective like this, using an objective, for example, like Harrisburg, in order to use some of that better terrain up in that area, like that high ground I have depicted there, which is a place today called Fairview Park. That would be a place where they could set up a defensive bowl like we had planned in Germany, where you could receive an attack and hopefully administer a nasty repulse like they were able to do at Fredericksburg, same sort of thing. So this is probably, what would have been might have given them a better result instead of Lee allowing himself to get sucked into the situation at Gettysburg, and this is a problem of having not defined a campaign objective. It got him off track and allowed himself to get off track. And he didn't, without it, he couldn't link his purposes, the overall objectives purposes to his army's purposes. Here's a good quote by someone von Moltke, who also sums up what I think happened in Pennsylvania. Any order that can be misunderstood will be misunderstood, because once they made contact with the enemy, all of a sudden everyone's thinking, well, let's start fighting, instead of staying away from the enemy and getting on to an objective where you can harness more benefit from it. And that's what happened. Now, Here are two more maps from my book, and I'll just go through these real quick here. Same kind of thinking. Now, we all know what happens after day one. The Confederates push elements of Union Corps through Gettysburg onto Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, and they form up there. And the next morning, Lee sees that Cemetery Ridge is only halfway filled in, so he thinks that's the flank. But it's, maybe it is at that point, but he hasn't even made up his mind what he wants to do. Then he rides around to the other side to go see Ewell, see if there's any possibility there. And there isn't. Ewell says no. And so Lee comes around again around 10 o'clock in the morning or so and tells Longstreet that he's going to be the main efforts and he will attack the Union flank up the Emmitsburg Road. You can see that his two divisions, Hood and McLaws, have to move into position. And once they get into position, then they find out that they're observed. Then they come up with an alternate plan, which Lee approves, which is now going to be this one here, where McLaws goes into the peach orchard and the wheat field, and Hood's going to go after the little round top there. And but by now, the Union has filled in their line, and Lee is still operating under earlier understanding, which is irrelevant. It's Hood who comes up with the idea that we should go around the round tops, because he sent some reconnaissance soldiers around and finds the Union wagon trains, and that if we go around them, we have a good chance of getting into their rear, falling on the flank of units that are coming in, or just getting in behind them and doing that. And I think that would be a much better option, because you want to go in a situation like this where your enemy isn't expecting you, to put them on the horns of a tactical dilemma, as I have here in this comment. And then as he reacts, he becomes vulnerable elsewhere. Now, some critics have said that, well, Hood doesn't know. Hood would have been attacked by Union reserves and so on and so forth. Well, that's probably true, but they wouldn't have had the advantage of hiding behind rocks in the high ground of the Devil's Den and all of that. If they have to fight, if they have to react to the Confederates showing up where they're not expecting them. An example in the future, in World War II, I think is an example where Hood's idea is done exactly right by Field Marshal Rommel to get around this defensive line, which is similar to the Union line at Gettysburg. This one here is anchored to the Mediterranean Sea and has a strong point at the bottom called Bir Hakeim, which would be equivalent to the Round Tops. And he rides around it with his main tank divisions and gets into the rear and eventually breaks this up and defeats the enemy. So I think this was right, and this is another point I make in the book. I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to move past this one and move on to this real quick here. Another example of what Longstreet was advocating, why it was more important than to shore up the situation in the Western Theater instead of going up into Pennsylvania, because we all know that Pennsylvania didn't work out. On the third day, they were defeated. And what he's talking about within the context of his strategic defense with an operational offense in Mississippi here to relieve the situation on Vicksburg would be to show up with additional force structure in time when Grant was didn't have all of his forces assembled. Now, what happens here is Grant, who'd already tried to take Vicksburg from the north and failed, moved to the south below Vicksburg and landed at Bruinsburg. He only could get across 20,000 right away. He shoves aside a Confederate brigade there at Gibson, that retreats toward Jackson. And then he starts, coming across, but he doesn't go directly at Vicksburg. He starts going to the northeast toward Jackson, Mississippi, which confuses the Confederate leadership in the area, which are spread out, because you got Pemberton with 23,000 in Vicksburg, you got 5,000 to the north, and Johnston was really the overall commander with another 8 over in Jackson. But they never come together and concentrate and go after Grant when he was, halfway. And when he's halfway there, Grant, you see the number there, Grant 35,000, he has to stop and take a tactical pause because he's waiting for Sherman to get across. Now there, he's at 35,000. And when you add up all the Confederate numbers there available, they're at 36,000. So that's 1-to-1 attacker to defender ratio. They have a chance. If they had come out of their defenses at Vicksburg and gone after him at that point, they would have had a better chance than what happened. And then, but consider this, what Longstreet was advocating, Western concentration. If you brought troops in a timely manner out there from Virginia to support this operation, then you've got 56,000 available, if they got there in time, to go after Grant when he was 35. Then you have a better chance of having a better outcome against them. And if Grant had been licked here in Mississippi before he had all his troops up, maybe he would have been sent home. Who knows? And if they got him out of their hair, that would have been a lot better for the Confederacy. So anyway, after Pickett's charge, after July the 3rd, they lose, and July the 4th, they lose Vicksburg. Lee realizes that Longstreet was right. You really do need to do something about the situation in the West, and that's going to become shoring up Braxton Bragg's army here. That's now been pushed down from Tennessee to northern Georgia at the end of the Tullahoma campaign. Bragg's lost Chattanooga, and he's further south, and Rosecrans has deployed into the state. But now Rosecrans has made a mistake. He's got his 3 corps way too spread out, as you can see here in this picture. And Bragg, to his credit, he recognizes this, and he's going to move after the center one and try and get after it before the other 2 can join. And if he can take it out, he's separated McCook, and he can go after the other 2 at his leisure with massive numerical superiority. So that's his initial plan. He starts moving toward Thomas. Here's his older map here, oriented to it. The red, of course, of the Confederates, and we see some of the Union blue there on the south side of Missionary Ridge, trying to come together as he comes at him. And Bragg's idea is he's going to land on the Union left flank and shove them down to the southwest into that area that I have a grayish bluish oval, which is called Lemore's Cove, which we call the military non-permissive terrain. And if you can get them into there, they're in a lot of trouble because they are separated from their new supply base Chattanooga, and they're probably going to have to infiltrate across the state line into Alabama and get up to Bridgeport Stevenson, which is off this map. But they could disintegrate if he gets them down into there. So I think his initial instinct of how to go after this is a good idea. Now, here's what happens on the first day of the battle on September the 19th. Longstreet is not here yet. He's coming. Now it's a couple more brigades, but he sent Hood ahead with 3 brigades, and these brigades move in on the left side, the left wing of the Confederate order of battle army, and the right wing is commanded by Polk. So the plan is, as I said, fold the right and push it down to the southwest. But the command and control of this army is not very good compared to Lee's army. So you have a lot of it's more like fighting in the first year of the war out in the east, where you still have the subordinates sort of fighting their own little fights against their opponent across the way, and there isn't a lot of good coordination. So you have a lot of piecemeal fights and no real cohesive push or penetration of the Union line anywhere. And that pretty much ends the day of the 19th, although the Confederates managed to push the Union back. But the good thing for the Union is they get all their disparate pieces put together again, and their army is together. So even though Bragg still has the initiative, the part about being chopped up, corps at a time isn't going to happen now because they're all together. Now, what happens is Longstreet shows up at 11 o'clock in the evening at Ringgold Station. He and his staff, they did bring enough horses for them to find their way to Bragg. He finds his way to Bragg and finds him around, I guess it's around 11. I think he arrived actually a little earlier. He finds Bragg at 11 and they have a conference, and Bragg gives him a map of the area and tells him to take over the left wing and get in order. And then he was going to run another redo of the battle plan for the 19th here on the 20th with an en echelon attack starting on the right, and he was going to push the Union Army again down to the southwest. Probably not a good idea to do because they probably expect the same thing, but that's what Bragg's going to try and do. And the word never gets down to D.H. Hill, which is the far right piece of this. So in the morning, when the attacks are supposed to be going in at 7 o'clock on the 20th, there's nothing going on. And Bragg goes down to the line and sees Confederate units, just preparing breakfast and not doing anything yet. And so he hurries up and sends his staff among the units and gets them cranked up and going. So the fighting doesn't really start until around probably 10 or 10:30 or so. And Longstreet's over here at 7 o'clock in the morning with his side ready to go, wondering what the heck's going on. Nothing. It's quiet. So he has to come up with something else. So he fashions, first I'll just tell you what happened in a nutshell. He fashions this attack column that I'm going to go through here in a minute. He smashes through, the Union right wing, collapses it completely, sends it to flight. Soldiers are panicking. Rosecrans panics. He flees the field, rides up to Chattanooga to get out on the wire to Washington, D.C. that this is a calamity. The Army's been defeated, and leaves it to Thomas to take over. Well, Thomas takes over, and he finds the hill of the Snodgrass Hill terrain feature as the place where he's going to make his stand. And he starts collecting up the panicking Union soldiers from the other wing and placing them there and telling them, you're going to stand here and you're going to fight. And also the other thinking man on the Union side is the Reserve Corps under Granger there at the top. He comes down to help stiffen up Thomas. And Thomas makes a stand there, and he's able to hold out until the end of the day, until it's dark, and then he can extricate the army to Chattanooga. But this is still a stunning victory for the Confederates, and this is why. What I'm going to tell you here, and then it'll wrap this up here. This here is the Brotherton cabin, which I'll call the Longstreet headquarters. There is at one point the battle, and behind it is the wood line where the 100th Illinois is. It just happens to be that one of the Georgia regiments in the Army of Northern Virginia that comes back out here is there's a Tom Brotherton who grew up right here on this property. This is the Brotherton property, and he suppose lived in that cabin, and he's connected with General Longstreet. General Longstreet asks him if there's a trail or a road that he could guide this column he's thinking of in his head to go through the woods and get through the other open terrain that he knows from the map that Bragg gave him to get through there, where he can get to the fast go terrain. Brotherton. Oh, by the way, this is picture taken in 1999 of the grandson of Private Brotherton there on the left, and meeting the great grandson of Lieutenant General Longstreet there on the right. I thought it was worth putting in this slideshow. So Brotherton, Private Brotherton, not the great grandson, not the grandson, but the real private, says here is there's a cow trail that goes through the woods, and which now today at the Battlefield Park is a road kind of cleared there, but you can see through there open meadow, and he tells General Longstreet, this one will go right through there, and you can guide your units on this, and that's exactly what Longstreet is looking for. So that's what he plans to do, and this is where he makes a leap forward. Now the map on the left shows you in the First World War that they were still, going through, they're coming out of their trenches in an attack, going through the no man's land at a walking pace and getting mowed down by machine guns out in this open space. And the difference between what they were doing in World War I and what they finally broke away from in World War II with the advent of, putting together, using the tank, other mechanization, was to break through a line and use the road system and the engines of these vehicles to get way into deep areas and avoid any of these bloody fights, but collapse your opponent by causing all kinds of havoc by getting in the rear. And that's what men like this man here at the lower right-hand corner, General Heinz Guderian, envisioned. He's the one who created the first tank divisions in World War II. And as you can see here in Russia, here's an example of what they do. The tank division punches through a line, but it doesn't get engaged, decisively engaged with the Russian units that are along the line. It penetrates and goes way into the rear areas, causing all kinds of command and control problems and the collapse of the main line, which allowed the Germans to do all these massive encirclements and gobble up huge chunks of terrain. Other thinkers like Field Marshal Manstein became expert at this as well. So, and the other part of this, offensive armored warfare, which became known in World War II as Blitzkrieg, was the German word, the Schwerpunkt, the point of the main effort, the heavy point, where you're going to lay your attack and what its composition is going to be. And this is what Longstreet does here at Chickamauga. Now, he doesn't know anything about Blitzkrieg in the future, none of that at all, but he does come up with the same kind of formation that you'd find in German offensive armored warfare tactics. And he gets over to the left side of the left wing of the Confederate Army, and he finds these 4 divisions from the west. They're in a line, which is Preston, Hindman, Johnson, and Stewart. And he tells them all to slide over to the right, fill up a vacant space that Stewart told them about, which they do. And so, Stewart closes up on Polk. Johnson's division is made up of the brigades of Fulton, McNair, and Sugg. And then he has Hood, instead of going to the line, like you'll read in his OR, he has him slide to the right behind Bushrod Johnson's division with the 5 brigades that are from Virginia, Sheffield, Robertson, Benning, Humphreys, and Kershaw, for a Schwerpunkt storm column of 8 brigades. And Hindman will be the division to the left to cover the left flank of these. Longstreet will retain Preston and pull him back as a reserve. So this is what he fashions. And instead of a wide attack front, he has a narrow attack front of 2 brigades wide. And as we say in military doctrine in the Army, we say you need roughly about a 3-to-1 attacker to defender ratio to be relatively successful to penetrate an enemy line. Well, he plans for 4-to-1. And then something happens that he doesn't even know about. Major General Wood is ordered to move over to support the other wing by Rosecrans because he thinks there's a gap over there. There is no gap, but he creates one right here in front of this column. So what really happens is, as this division, Union division, is moving, 1 brigade is still in the way when this thing goes through, and it's 8-to-1, and it gets steamrolled by Longstreet's attack column. Anyway, this kind of thinking is, exactly what the Germans are talking about. Here's Field Marshal Rommel trying to figure out how to get into Brook. He talks about concentrating strength at one point, forcing a breakthrough. And this kind of wording is common in a lot of these thinkers. And we finally have our thinker over there, General Patton. Now he was frustrated with watching what Eisenhower's idea was to land in Normandy, and all these other guys like Bradley and Hodges and Montgomery and so on, where he says here, they're just trying to push all along the front, but they have no power anywhere. This is his own quote. And then he comes into the picture when Third Army becomes operational, and he turns that on its head and says, no, we should attack through a narrow area with overwhelming forces and then get out, out into the open country and drive. And then we can get in behind these larger formations and get around them and cut them off. And that's exactly what they do on a large scale in France. But here in 1863, you see this at work as well. Here's the Brotherton cabin to the right, the LD, the start point, the line of departure, and the distance they have to go is only 175 paces, which is a huge improvement over this situation at Gettysburg. 100-mile wide, 1 mile wide formation, shoulder to shoulder, all these brigades. They have to go a mile in. And so they're out in the open exposed the whole way, and they get broken up by artillery and musket fire. Here, the attack formation is only 450 yards wide. These are the two lead brigades of Bushrod Johnson's division, Fulton and McNair. Here's a picture at the plaque at the Brotherton cabin of an artist's depiction of what it must have looked like when these echelons were coming out. There's the first one that the Union guys see, the second one, and the third one's coming out of the woods. And there are two more behind that they don't even know. So just irresistible power. And upper here, the map on the upper left, you see how it looks as it goes through. And Longstreet turns its direction to the right, the avenue approach, to try and get in behind Thomas, get around Thomas, and take the two gaps, the operational objectives, Rossville and of course the McMarlin Gap on Missionary Ridge. And Longstreet wants to bag this whole army. So that's a very modern attack formation, a World War II style attack formation that he does there at Chickamauga. And I think I'm at 1 hour just about exactly. So I'm going to stop right there. And thank you all for listening.
That was great, Harold. Thank you so much for that overview, the tactical. I love how you brought your experience to it. Like, this is something that you know, and getting to bring in a couple of different wars, comparing to Civil War.
Right. Thank you. I think it makes it different. It's a different way of looking at it, isn't it?
Certainly. And I know with the Historical Society, we're really trying to look at, our battle story or the history of Adams County and looking at it in a new light. So I really enjoyed how you brought that to the table with your own experience. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for all of you that listened this evening. Remember, we're going to have another one of these next Thursday. They're every Thursday night, so something you can count on at 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you're watching the replay, let us know that you watch the replay below. So we'll see you all next week. Thank you again, Harold. That was excellent.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.